Mission Chats with John Crow.
Well, hello again, everybody, and thank you so much for your interest in Mission Chats. It's always a joy to have these conversations with people I know, and in this particular case, someone whose family I know from many, many years ago, back in my boarding school days and growing up in the Ivory Coast. So, Steve and Rhonda, it's so good to have you with us here on Mission Chats today. I know we've taken a little while to find a space in schedules that match up, but I really appreciate you being willing to take this next little bit of time to share a bit of your story and how God's been at work in your lives and through your lives and the various facets of ministry that you've had. So I'm excited to learn a little more detail about that. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you. And just love to hear, first of all, just your personal journey of faith, how you came to the Lord for both of you, but also how you found each other and, how the Lord has led you through all of that.
Well, thank you very much. Lovely to sort of catch up with you again, John. Yeah, it's been many, many years. And as you say, family connection, but I think also there's that sort of lifelong connection with MKs that,
Right.
You meet all around the world. And, as our kids have just continued on that tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And, as a result of that as well, because they make friends all around the world, they themselves end up flying the nest and going a lot further than many people's families do. And ours have certainly just spread all over the place. So maybe you start sharing first.
Okay, well, I'm an Irish lassie. I come from Northern Ireland and I've grown up there, and that's where we are now, where we're based. My family, Christian family, grown up in the church activities, Sunday school, girls' brigade, youth club outside of church. I went to little good news club meetings and faith mission meetings where the missionary thrust was very important.
Mm.
I was also quite involved in church and leading Sunday school and played the piano and so forth. We also attended quite a lot of missionary meetings. I came to faith personally when I was 12, and that was in my church at a girls' club called the Girls' Brigade.
Okay.
And I do remember when I was 17 going to a missionary conference in Bangor, Northern Ireland, where I pledged to God that if he was willing to have me as his servant overseas in mission, that I would be willing to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So in line with that, then I ended up going to university in Belfast to train to be a high school teacher of history and religious studies.
Okay.
And as you're a student, you have long summers off. So I always went away to France mainly. I went with OM to France, with our world ministries to France and Morocco, and also then to our mission, which was UFM. Mm-hmm. That used to be called an Evangelized Field Mission. Mm-hmm. Now it's called United for Mission. And that's where I met Steve in France on a youth team.
Yep.
And after 2 weeks, that was us signed, sealed and delivered. He went back to England and I went back to Northern Ireland. We got married in 1990, and then we visited Ivory Coast in 1992 to see Steve's parents, who actually have been missionaries for 40 years in Congo and in Ivory Coast. So we went there with one child to have a look-see.
Mm-hmm.
And then we were always looking ahead to when God would call us. It wasn't until 1997 that we went to Paris for further French studies, hoping to go to Congo. Mm-hmm. Never got there because the war broke out. Mm. And instead we ended up going to Babwa school in the year 2000 with 3 girls based at the missionary school there. And then we ended up in India in 2006.
Yeah,
so that's a little bit of our background. We had 4 girls. One is in Australia now. She's 33. The other's 30, was in Canada, and now she's back in England. That's Susanna. And Leah is in Liverpool in England, and Alyssa is back here in Northern Ireland.
Right. That's wonderful. And yeah, like you said, daughters have been around the world. I'm sure it's nice when they come back a little closer to home as well. But Steve, do you want to add anything to that? Maybe a little bit of your journey?
Yeah, my journey was quite different. I mean, I grew up in a Christian family as well, as my parents were missionaries, and they went out in late 1960 to Congo. So I was born in Congo, and I grew up in a small village. All of my friends were the local village boys and girls. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was a very, very different background, a different sort of upbringing to many families and many kids. Quite isolated in the sense of being isolated from the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. But my world was quite a big world in that village. There was no boundaries as such. It just extended. And there were other missionary families there with kids as well from different countries, worked alongside my parents. Where we were was quite isolated, and homeschool was the only option to start with.
Right.
from my parents. But then it was very evident that really needed to look further afield than that to something a bit more socially integrated.
Right.
And so my parents looked at a boarding school, which was in the Congo. And at the age of 6, I went to this boarding school where I stayed there for a whole term.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would have come home. So we were away from my parents, I would say, for about 9 months of the year.
Right.
From the age of 6. It was a really, really good school, great dorm parents, great teachers, a great family, and you have all the same issues that you'd have, I would say, in schools here, many schools here, some difficulties that you're always having to deal with and face. You're not immune to that. So there was always challenges like that when you were growing up. And as a result, made friends which were from all over the world.
Right.
And to this day, I still keep in touch with many of them. And it was really at this time, shortly after a little while at school, it would have been the Easter. We had a mission team coming from America that came out for 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
They were running a spiritual week at the school. And it was during this time that I became really aware of my need to accept Christ.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I knew it. I had been taught it. I had seen the evidence of God in my parents' life, in the lives of those around me. And I remember one thing that was really quite poignant was one young fellow who was about 23 at the time, who had come out on the team. It kind of really got close to some of us. You kind of bonded with one or two of them. And I do remember this guy that got really close to. He became quite ill when he was there. He had contracted malaria and he didn't survive. He died. And, for a 6-year-old, someone whom you got to know, someone whom you had become quite friendly with and had listened to stories that he was sharing. And suddenly you know that you need to make a decision about handing over your life to God.
Mm-hmm.
And just to throw this into the mix, that this guy here had just died.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything that they had been talking about suddenly became very, very, very poignant. So much so that I realized that if I was to die tomorrow, where would I go? And this was the age of 6.
Yeah.
So whenever someone says to me, they don't understand, a child is quite young, I said, listen, at the age of 6, I understood without a question of doubt.
Mm-hmm.
So much so that apparently when I went home that Easter, now it used to take about 3 to 4 days to drive home from where we were for my parents. And I went home and I spent, the Easter holidays. So that was nearly 4 weeks. We had quite long holidays. Later on, my mother told me that holiday, I cried myself to sleep almost every single night.
Mm.
And it was because the realization that my sister and my 2 brothers were going to go to hell if they had not accepted Jesus Christ. And this was me as a 6-year-old.
6. Wow.
So I understood and I knew the consequences, the severity of it in my capacity at that age to be able to understand. So it's something that I have, been very conscious about, even with my own kids. They need to know.
Yeah.
From an early age.
Mm-hmm.
And so we raised our kids sharing, teaching Bible stories and not really pulling punches, just letting them know.
Right.
So that was quite an early age. And then I left Congo at the age of 12 and then we went to Ivory Coast just as a visit. And I knew at the age of 12 that I was going to go back to work in Africa.
Okay.
Just knew.
Right.
And I felt that agricultural engineer training was going to be something that I was really interested in.
Yeah.
And roll on the years later, I ended up training as an agricultural engineer. I ended up going back to Africa. So again, it's never too young.
Mm-hmm.
God speaks to young people. And I think we just need to be available and to be able to hear and listen to what's being said at times and just to know when God is actually speaking.
Mm-hmm.
So shortly after that, I was baptized.
Okay.
I felt it necessary to make a public declaration. And we were involved in a Brethren Church mission hall. And I remember my baptism was coming up and I invited friends from school coming. And I don't think the small mission hall really knew what hit them. Okay. When about a third of the congregation was increased as a result of friends coming from school to see what was this baptism all about. Yeah. But for me, it was great. At the age of 14, just to be able to make that public declaration of my faith. So that is my background and my journey up until that point. And of course, that was only part of it,
Sure. Yeah, that's right. No, that's great. I always love to hear, just where the Lord spoke to you along your life journey. Like you said, sometimes we think little ones of that age, how much they really understand. But for you, it's been a lifelong following of the Lord, and exciting to hear that. Rhonda, I think you mentioned after you got married, you got involved serving at a boarding school. And I think that's been a part of your story with your family as well. So I'd love to hear where the Lord led you then as a couple into, the types of ministry you've been involved in. If you want to bring us up to today as well.
Well, we were in Ivory Coast from 2000 to 2002. It was an English educational system. I taught history, French and RS there. Obviously got involved in the life of the dorms, lots of sport, lots of activity. I loved that type of lifestyle.
Yeah.
And then we had to come home. I had brain malaria. I was very ill and I was pregnant at the time. So we did come home and had the intention of going back. But as you know, Ivory Coast became involved in a civil war and the school was closed and no one has ever got back since.
Right.
And that's a long time ago. Then we thought, where is God leading us? There was a couple at the school from Australia and they ended up going to Asia and they said, look, there is a mission school there that would like a history teacher for Steve to be involved in estates management and running the gardens and the building work. Would you be interested? And we thought, no, we're not really interested in Asia. It's always been Africa, French-speaking Africans speak French. We thought, not really. But we threw out the fleece and we prayed that God would make it clear to us. And within 6 months, we had the necessary finance to go to Asia, to the school there. Our old girls were very different ages. The oldest one was 14 and the youngest one was 4.
Wow.
So the times and their ages, they loved Ivory Coast. So it wasn't really an issue. Let's go again. We're based in Northern Ireland. While we were home, I went back into a little bit of teaching and the girls had the schooling here. So we ended up going to Asia. A bigger school, maybe 30 different nationalities at the school teaching. I was also involved in a little good news club in the community. We were involved with an orphanage and just living in the dorms with like 200 teenage girls. So we were very busy with these girls.
Right.
So we were involved in that type of ministry as well. When we came home in 2011, then I was involved in getting the girls back into life here. The oldest girl went to university in England. One girl stayed behind to finish her schooling. And then I had the 2 younger girls to get based back in here.
Right.
When I come home, I was involved in a learning support in a high school, working one-to-one with a lad who had challenging behaviour. Then I trained to be a cognitive behaviour therapist and I used that a little bit in a surgery. But I love working with teenagers. So then I did a little bit of preventative mental health skills based on CBT, helping kids to monitor and manage distressing thoughts and feelings and behaviours. But there was only budget for 1 year and it was 1 day a week. So that then came to an end. So recently I've just retired, but I've just done a little bit of supply teaching in high school here, 1 or 2 days a week. But now that has come to an end, I'm more free to be involved in ministry with Steve because even though I was home with the girls in a supportive role, Steve continued every year 3 or 4 times going to Asia to be involved in his ministry. So now I'm more free to be involved in that. And I have been in Asia with him and I have been in Moldova this year and we're hoping to go maybe for longer next year.
Yeah. So Steve, tell me a little bit about the type of work you're doing in Asia when you go. I'm curious about one facet of what you do, and we'll dive into that shortly. But yeah, just from your perspective, what are the types of things you have going on ministry-wise?
As you know, certain areas of Asia, it's very difficult to be able to get in and to work as a missionary. So you have to be a little bit more creative with what you do and how to do that. And this is something I believe that all of us have got gifts and all of us have got interests that God uses. He doesn't just make us all the exact same package. We're all made up differently. And, I'm an outdoors person. I'm a practical person. I love motorbikes, machinery. And as an agricultural engineer, I was always then looking at, equipment, machinery, but also looking at other aspects of agriculture as well. So when we were working in this school, that was fine. But subsequently after that, for me to return, I didn't have an employment visa to be at a specific place.
Okay.
So for me, it was a little bit more challenging as how is it that I'm going to continue on in that country and working there? So I looked at these different things. One of them, I had already started developing a motorbike ministry.
Okay.
And the motorcyclists that I was particularly interested in were what I would say long distance travelers, overland bikers.
Sure.
And these are bikers who, disappear for 3 months, 6 months. There's a couple that I've known quite well. They've disappeared for about 16, 17 years now.
Wow.
And these type of people I've also found are quite interested in different cultures, different languages. They have a little bit more of an open mind to the world that's around us.
Right.
Quite a different mindset to what we would look at as a traditional sort of biking community. And my background lended itself an awful lot to this, because I had been to a couple events and one or two people got to know me. And the next thing, I was getting people coming to me and saying, oh, by the way, Joe over there said to come and talk to you because thinking of traveling out to this country or whatever. And I had been there in that country. I'd lived there, worked there. I could have been in Africa or in Asia. And suddenly you had this connection with people.
Right.
And I found it as a great way in which I would spend time with them, sharing with them. Of course, I had a lot of contacts in these countries.
Yeah.
And I would have said, well, here's a number for somebody if you're in that area or whatever, or if you get stuck, give us a call. I have one or two contacts. Those are very useful to have. So I found this, I used this as one of my ministries. So for me, it happened also, I used this in Asia.
Right.
A massive big biking community there. And so I've used this one aspect for evangelism.
Okay.
And I have a platform online as well, which I would use for that. Another tool for ministry is environmental construction.
Okay.
And looking at alternative energy sources. And it tied in with a little bit of the work that I was doing in Asia.
Right.
And then just the way the economics were going and cost of materials and things were changing. I was exploring and looking elsewhere, and I came across this thing called rammed earth buildings. So I explored these, and of course they fitted in with my passion for the environment, but also just the simplicity behind it, and also economically, certainly for rural areas, it was very, very viable alternative.
Right.
So basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to replace the concrete. The whole cement industry is actually quite an unenvironmentally friendly industry. And if we can avoid that, if we can try to change something from being a concrete jungle, we know all the side effects to that. And, it has even had a big impact for global warming as well. So basically what rammed earth is you are taking subsoil, which has a natural clay content in it, which is a bonding adhesive element. It has its small stones and its particles. It has all the natural particles in it. It has a sand already in it as well.
Okay.
So it has the elements for construction. Now, what we do is we take this subsoil and we sieve it to take out any of the larger stones. And then we make a shuttering system. Easiest way to describe it is a bit like a big cake tin with four sides. And these sides can just be dismantled. The mix that goes into it is a fairly dry mix, because quite often you've got sufficient moisture content already in the soil that you have just dug up. So what you do is you take a layer of this and you put in about 4 inches into the bottom of your shuttering system. I use plywood sheeting. So it's 1.8 meters or 6 foot long. The height will be about 4 foot. The width of the wall will be depending on whether it's a single story or 2-story building. Now it could be 18 inches or it could be 2 foot wide. And you put in 4 inches of this sort of semi-dry mix and you ram it down, you pound it. And then you put another 4 inches on and you ram it. And you just repeat this process all the way until you get to the top of your shutter. And then when you got to the top of your shutter, you then dismantle your shuttering, mount the shuttering on top of the wall that's just been built. And this is the beauty about it, because it's dry. It's hot. And you can build up to 8 foot high, so ceiling height in one go. And you basically just build it around your foundation all the way around the building. Now it's environmentally friendly. Thermally, it's very, very good. It has a great ambient temperature inside the building. So if it's a very, very hot climate, you'll find that inside the building, mid-afternoon, it's lovely and cool. It absorbs the heat very slowly, unlike concrete, but then it dissipates the heat inward slowly again, unlike concrete. So at nighttime, in the middle of the night, you still have this sort of warmth that's been brought in there. Whereas if it's a concrete building, it would be very cold inside. And also what I find is in the cities, it can be quite costly, as in it can be very comparable to a concrete building because the labor costs, there's more labor costs involved. But if you're working in a village, in a rural area, your labor costs are much, much cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And also you can have much more of a sense of community. So you can actually have groups of people, families that can help to work with each other to help
Right.
build each other's houses.
Yeah.
So again, that reduces the costs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a big question that a lot of people ask is how durable is it because of the
Right.
rains? Great Wall of China was partially built like this.
Okay.
There are many examples all across Europe of 300 or 400 years old.
Okay.
Now, if you go to North Africa, you'll find examples of this, maybe 1,000 years old, maybe a couple thousand years old.
Right. No, thank you. That's good to understand that a little bit more. Go ahead.
Basically, John, he just plays with mud and motorbike.
That's right. Hey,
As my kids say, I never grew up.
right. That's wonderful.
So I studied this a little bit. I went to a course, and this is quite funny. I went to a course over where my mum and dad were. And I stayed there with them at that time for the weekend. And I just was chatting away to Dad about it. And the next thing he says, you do realize that I was doing this in Congo in 1960.
Right. Okay.
So, it's funny how things just go right round in circles,
Yeah.
And so we got chatting about this. And of course, the modern techniques are quite different. So, we've moved forward with different things. But I now run workshops in Asia where a weekend, or it could be even a project. I have a project coming up in March,
Right.
where I will be training people in this, but we've got this building project. So people will be coming along to learn it. Some will come for a few days, some will come for a bit longer.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll be training some builders that were actually going to be there the whole time as well.
Yeah.
But I use this as a means for evangelism.
Yeah. Fantastic.
During the day, it's all training, it's all building up the relationships and the trust between people. But the evening time is that downtime
Mm-hmm.
where we sit down, we chat about ourselves, we become personal.
Right.
That is the opportunity. And for me as well, there's a couple things that I would use as finding out a little bit about them and their beliefs and their belief in a certain system, etc. And it's not long before they're asking me the same question.
Yeah.
They've opened the door, the opportunities are there.
Right.
So I have just found that particularly these two ministries are something
Mm-hmm.
that I have done. And I have been training about 200 people by 2017. And I needed really to bring all these people kind of together to pull together my workshop manual, my shuttering design, my other information and resources. So I opened up a closed Facebook account.
Okay.
And we just invited all these people into it. And it gave me this one central place. Last week, we've got just about 24,000 members
Wow.
worldwide,
Okay.
every single continent.
Yeah.
And I have got engineers in there. I have got contractors in there. I have got architects in there, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been some great opportunities, making friendships,
Mm-hmm.
Particularly those whom you meet.
Sure. Yeah.
And you meet them, you meet their family, you just spend that time with them.
Mm-hmm.
And that it just opens up so many doors for evangelism.
Yeah.
So again, it's this whole thing of utilizing the gifts that God has given us, our interests,
Yeah.
and to use them in places, making ourselves available. That's one of the ministries. With our mission, I kind of front this practical side of ministry as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called Operation Centurion.
Okay.
And it takes its name from the centurion who built the synagogue out of his own money for the Christians. And this is a practical ministry where we are able to go and help missionaries who have got a project.
Mm-hmm.
So I would go and help them. I would then try to find volunteers who would come and join in. So these would be practical people, tradesmen. They would come from different places as well, depending on where the project is.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's just this practical ministry of getting together people who would love to get involved in mission, but they don't know how.
Sure.
And quite often with these people, some of them will come to me and they say, well, listen, I don't have a particular skill.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, but you can be a Barnabas.
Right.
Every tradesperson needs a spare pair of hands.
Mm-hmm.
But also what they need is they need a companion. They need somebody who will work alongside them.
Mm-hmm.
When a job is really tough and difficult, they need that encouragement themselves.
Right. Yeah.
And I said, that's who you are. And you are encouraging other people. And we're all there to encourage the missionary, the pastor, or whomever it is that we're working for. And this is what this is all about. So the Operation Centurion is something which I would front for our mission. Again, I'm a practical guy. At heart, I'm an evangelist.
So I'm hoping to go back now and join Steve and run the mental health course.
Right. Yeah.
To people who work with maybe trafficked children or
Mm-hmm.
work with children who have suffered trauma I've done it in a church in Asia. I'm going to do it in a couple of schools and another church, just to people who work with children, to give them strategies and skills to help them. So this is a new ministry for me.
Yeah, exciting.
It's new, and I only started it there in March when I went back to Asia, and I tried it for the first time.
Yeah.
CBT is quite new to the people, and they really benefited from it. They can use the skills and strategies to help them personally and other people. So I'm hoping to develop that ministry with Steve. While he does building with mud, I'll do building with their brains.
Right. Sounds like a great partnership.
How do we get that together as a ministry together?
Right.
It's something that we're looking into now.
Yeah. Right.
Again, all these things are, they're just a tool for evangelism.
And I love that. That's really your heart behind it all. So,
it is.
cool.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, as you shared a bit, while a lot of your ministry has been very practical focus, it comes back to being there, getting to know people, sharing the gospel. And I'd love to hear, just one or two stories how you've seen, that open up doors for the growth of the kingdom of God. Yes,
whenever we were in Asia, monsoon rain has come 3 months of the year where it's just rain. And where we lived, it was up on a mountain where there was a large town. And when the rains came down, the people there made very basic shelters, maybe out of houses out of plastic or wood or whatever, and they were not durable.
Right.
And so when the rains came down the mountain, the houses were washed away and many of the people drowned because of the landslides.
Right. Okay.
And so Steve was very much affected by that and thought we need to teach people to build homes that are durable, and that's where the rammed earth were started there.
Okay.
And so there was a lady we got to know, and she had a little good news club in an area which was Muslim area, and she had little kids there, but her house was leaking, and so we managed to get that roof done, and her good news club continues until today.
So there was another one where there was a couple that we got to know. They had a young child, and they lived in a tin shack. And where we lived in that country, it was quite cold at night time during the winter months, quite wet, but temperatures would drop down to about freezing. And if you're living in a corrugated tin sheet shack, it's just not warm inside. The health conditions are not very great.
Right.
So I made a proposal to them about helping to maybe raise some funds back at home from friends who would help to donate towards that. But the agreement was that they would also raise finances for the house as well. Okay. So it wasn't just a complete one-way thing. There was commitment from them. So we ended up building this house for them. Now, they were quite a strong Hindu family, and we built the house, but we had, when we came to, the house was actually finished. They wanted to have a blessing for the house, a house opening, warming sort of thing. And they did all their prayers and their rituals and everything else. I'd been invited to come along to it, and I was in two minds about whether I should or should not go. But I said, well, I've been involved in this from the very beginning. And, I felt God had brought me to them, into their lives. So I went along. And what was interesting was I sat at the back and watched all of this going on. And then right at the very, very end, when almost everything was finished, he then turned around and called me to come up to pray and ask my God to bless this home.
Okay.
And so I just thought, well, you know what? This wasn't at the very beginning. This was actually at the very, very end, when everything else was done. So what was going to be probably remembered more than anything is always your last words. It is always the last action.
Yep.
So, I then pray that God would truly bless this home. Well, what happened very soon after that was we had been working with children and running good news clubs, and they had asked if they could have a good news club in their home.
Okay.
So we started a good news club in their home in this shanty town.
Right.
And it was quite a challenge because they had a lot of threats from their neighbors and who were very anti-Christian. And what struck me was I'd heard about it, and I knew that his life was potentially his life was being threatened.
Okay.
And I felt that we could move this out of his house in another home nearby so the kids could still go to it, but not right inside that ghetto area. But he turned around and he said, no, I want to continue this. It's a testament to what you have done in this community. And I just thought, wow, okay, this is big, And so we continued a bit more, but then we could see that there was actually life-threatening threats were being given. So we actually moved it from there.
Okay.
But this is how God works. All those kids just came to the new place, which was just not that far away.
Sure. Yeah.
So we hadn't lost any ministry, but a seed had been planted right inside that ghetto already.
Yeah.
And there's just another example of it, and it's an extreme example. There's another story I would like to share as well, which again is along the lines, it reflects a little bit about the work that I do. Now, the way that I like to sort of share this, it's a reminder that we need to always be careful what we say, because we never know who is listening. When I was working at this one boarding school, I was involved in inter-school sports, and I used to coach badminton and basketball and football.
Right.
And had taken the schoolgirls badminton team down to this tournament. Now, we didn't do too well. We got knocked out fairly quickly. And the basic rule was that when you got knocked out, you took everybody back to school so they could go back into their classrooms and get on with their schoolwork. Well, John, you probably know I don't normally do the things that everybody is telling me what I should be doing or shouldn't be doing. So I actually said to the girls, I said, would you girls like to stay on? And they all just said, I think you can learn an awful lot by watching all these other kids. So we spent the rest of the day down there. Now, the girls' final came, and these two girls were playing, and these two girls were so tightly matched that it went 1 point one way, 1 point the other, and it just kept on like this. And eventually, one girl won. And the coach for the girl that had lost immediately got up onto the court, went over to the girl, and gave her the biggest slap across her face.
Oh, wow.
Now, you can imagine right there in public, in front of everybody. Well, my blood boils when I see something like that. Sure. When I see injustice happening to somebody who cannot defend themselves. Now, I'm a man, okay? So you're going to put this in context. Well, there may have been 2 or 3 other men there in the whole tournament. I got up and went straight onto that court, and I stood in between the coach and the girl, and I looked at the girl, and I said to her, today was not your day. If it had been yesterday, you could have won that match. If it was tomorrow, you could have won that match. But today, it was her day. And I said, you should never be ashamed of your performance today. You played absolutely brilliantly. And I said to her, just turn around, and I want you to look at that team over there where I've just come from. Every one of those girls have learned an awful lot of how to play badminton from your skills. And then I turned to the coach, and I said to her, you should be ashamed of yourself. This girl did absolutely brilliantly. And the only thing you could consider doing was coming up here and giving her biggest slap because she lost. And I went and sat down. Let's roll on 5 years. I'm going to get a visa. So I'm in Belfast, and I go to get a visa, and I pick my number and I wait for my turn. And there's 3 desks. So this is a bit like Russian roulette.
Right.
My number happens to be at this one desk. So I go to this desk. I hand my passport there with all my visa application details and everything else. And there's a young girl sitting there behind the desk from the country that I'm applying the visa for. And she looks through my passport and flicks through it. And the next thing is like, oh, did you work at this particular school? I said, yes. And my heart sunk at that time because I knew somebody 2 weeks earlier, a former colleague, had actually had visa rejected.
Okay.
And I just said, I did. And she said, did you coach badminton? I said, yes, I did. She said, you came and coached me for 3 months. I did a coach exchange with somebody else, and they came over to our school and they coached another sport. And for 3 months, for a whole long term, I coached their kids. And she was one of the girls that I had coached. And I thought, oh, right, okay. We chatted a little bit. And then she said, you know what? I remember you saying something at the all-girls badminton tournament. And she told me about that story, which I had forgotten about completely.
Yeah. Right.
But she had been sitting just on the edge of the court.
Okay.
And she said, I've never forgotten what you said to that girl. And for me, it's like, we need to be careful what we say, how we say it. Make it meaningful. Make it poignant. Make it something worth listening to and hearing. without even doing it deliberately. There was this girl, and God uses these things. God had already known that he was going to do this 5 years later.
Right.
Well, you know what? I got a 5-year visa for that country as a result of this girl hearing that and then recommending that I get an extended visa.
Right.
And why she was in Belfast? No idea.
No, exactly. That's amazing.
She wasn't from
Wonderful.
our culture or country.
Sure. Yeah.
So these are things.
God's perspective of how things work themselves out for good. So, yeah, I love that.
Well, I have found that, John, I have found that so often in the work that I do, people are brought across my path over and over and over and over and over again. Random people. And sometimes they may be an insignificant person in their eyes, but in God's eyes, they're significant because they're going to be doing something significant, or I'm going to be doing something significant with them.
Yeah.
And that's, God works like that so much.
Lovely. Thank you. Great stories there. Some real encouragements. You've shared a little bit what missions has looked like from your own experience, which is wonderful. Just, the variety of what it can look like. Basing the answers to my next question on that kind of background experience, what advice would you give others who are considering mission service themselves?
The first thing is get involved at home. Get involved in your local church. Because mission is not about going overseas.
Right.
Mission is about reaching out to other people. So you have workplace, you have colleagues at work, you might be in school, you might be in college, there might be different clubs that you're involved in. You need to start doing mission at home. And, many of us we are concerned about the gifts that we have or the lack of gifts that we have. We don't know the skills.
Yeah.
But what I would say to anybody is I say, listen, God will provide you what you need, and don't ever compare yourself with somebody else. We can see how God used different people throughout Scripture for different tasks. And God choosing David to do something that Jeremiah could never do.
Right.
And vice versa. And God chose Ruth to do something that Abraham could never do. And this, I think, is an important thing that we all need to understand is God has given each of us individual gifts. God wants us to get involved in his story. Are we willing to do that?
Yeah.
And so what I would say to people is the same with like those who come onto a work team. What I need is a willingness to come, an openness to try anything and do anything that needs to be done. Get involved.
Yeah.
We will all learn skills. And there might be a skill that once somebody learns by getting involved, you spend some time doing it. And then find out what your gifts are. And that's another thing. I think we all need to find out what our gifts. God has given each of us gifts that we need to develop. We need to hone those gifts and to make best use of them, because it's maybe at home that we are doing our schooling and our study and our preparation and the training part of it. And maybe then God decides, right, we've done that. Now I want you to step out a little bit and I want you to go further afield.
Yeah.
So my recommendation straight away is to get involved in your church. Get involved in your local community. Look for opportunities as well, because sometimes a church doesn't see something, whereas you might see it.
Right.
Go and get involved. If you don't, then God will use somebody else. It's not going to stop God from doing what he wants to do.
Yeah, for sure.
He's just going to go and get somebody else, which means you are going to miss out on that massive big blessing and being able to see how God is involved in your own life. So God is wanting us to get involved in his story. Just get out there and do it.
No,
Could I add to that?
Yes.
I mean, you need to be sure that God is calling you, because it's hard on the mission field. There are struggles. I think also we need to learn how to handle conflict better at home before we go to a different culture with different people with different nationalities, because quite a lot of mission people come home because of infighting or conflict in their team. Christians not able to handle conflict well. And I think we need to learn to handle that. Also, we have strengths and we have vulnerabilities. Know what yours are. And sometimes our vulnerabilities, our weaknesses can become a strength. I think you have to be flexible. You have to be willing to realize that there will be lots of frustrations. You may go thinking you're going to be a plumber or an electrician or a preacher. You have to be willing to fill maybe another role that you didn't think you were going to fill. And be willing to go where that need is. You may think I'm gifted in a different place, but you may end up doing something totally different than what you thought you were going to do. And that can cause a little bit of tension So I think you've got to be aware that you need to be flexible. You have to be willing to change in those type of areas, but certainly learning to resolve conflict and work on that is a thing. Have a strong support team at home as well. Don't be a lone ranger missionary.
Right.
And at the end of the day, mission is God's work. It's not about us. We are not center stage in mission. We're God's sidekick in a way, or we're in the wings doing His bit. It is not all about me, what I can contribute, what programs I can do, how I can benefit people. Yeah, those are great things, but mission is reflecting God's heartbeat for a lost and needy world and being His hands and His feet in the small, everyday ordinariness of life, wherever we are placed. It's God calling individuals to be involved in His work.
Right.
And we've got to step back and say, it's not about me. I'm not center stage here. It's how can I be God's hands and feet in a place where He has called me, and whatever that involves. And it will involve change.
Right. Yeah.
And being flexible and being amenable and seeing things outside the box, because we cannot be in control. And we sometimes have to give up that sense of control if we like to control things, because in the mission field, working with so many different cultures and people, that was out the window.
And one thing I would add to that as well is I'm quite strong on the whole call. God calls people, and being a missionary is a special calling. There's no doubt about that. We're not special people.
Right.
But there's a special calling. The 12 disciples had a special call. They certainly were not special people as such. When you look at them, they were really random people. And the other thing about having a call is, if we cannot fall back and say, I know that God has called me, what have you got when your back is against the wall and everything is falling apart? If you cannot turn around and say, God, you called me, this is your problem. If you can't say that, you'll be home on the first plane and you'll come back and you'll be in a real difficult situation, a difficult place. Spiritually, you'll be in a difficult place. Emotionally, mentally as well. Yeah. And also with your church, you'll be in a difficult place. So that's why I say it's important to have that call, to know that God has called you. Now, I've seen with my parents, the back was against the wall. I've seen it with ourselves when we have sat there and watched our little one dying in front of us and having to stop and say, God, you knew this was going to happen. You have brought us here. All we can do is completely and utterly trust that you have this in control. And at that time, the only thing I could do was make a call to my mom and dad back at home and say to them, please get people to pray. And you know, when I had done that, I had this massive sense of relief and peace that came over me. I just knew that God was dealing with it. Now, if I didn't have that sense that God had called me out here, I would say I would have been in a very, very different scenario. That's why I really do firmly believe that you do need to recognize that call, that God's called you into full-time missionary work.
Yeah.
But it goes back further than that, because this same child, when I was ill with brain malaria, I was in and out of consciousness. And I remember the doctor saying to me, because she was only 4 months in my womb, he said, well, we can't save both of them, the mother or the child, because the amount of treatment I'll get, the baby won't live. So then we came home and she grew and she was totally fine and she was born. This same child then, when she's age 4, we think it's a burst appendix, there's no doctor. We actually do find a doctor in another village and is able to sort the problem out. So today she is 22 years old and she's getting married and she is a gem.
Wonderful.
But I would also say that for young people, going on mission teams is a really good thing. To be immersed, even for a couple of weeks or a month, that's a good thing. Mission has changed. People don't go for the long years now and you never hear from them again. And there's a lot of short-term work, which is a good thing to do and has benefits as well. So those short mission trips are very beneficial, just to go, see, look, immerse yourself in a different climate and culture. Those are beneficial to do as well. And you don't always have to go forever and ever and say goodbye, we'll see you in 30 years. I mean, you don't have to think that way. Our world is so small.
Well, the world is very small. I mean, WhatsApp is amazing. Communication today is totally different to what it was 30 years ago.
But I mean, failure isn't final.
No.
If you make a mistake
Amen.
and you get it wrong and you come home broken, God uses broken people and
Yep.
He'll use them for further ministry. There's no such word as final in God's book. He just renews the brokenness and says, right, let's do something else about this in a different ministry.
Also, what we see as failure is not necessarily what God sees as failure. God will use our failures to bring glory to Him.
Amen.
And that is ultimately what it's all about, is bringing glory to Him.
And as Amy Carmichael said, my favorite person of all time said, don't waste your pain.
Yeah.
Good
That's a
word.
good note to finish on, right?
Yes. Yeah, well, thank you both so much again for the time and just for sharing what your ministry looks like, but more importantly, what God's been teaching you along that journey. An encouragement to have this conversation. Now, if someone would like to stay in touch with you, learn more about your ministry as you move forward, what's the best way they could do that?
Probably email the Steve Rhonda one that you have.
Yeah. Okay. I'll post that in the show notes.
If anybody is particularly interested in the whole Rammed Earth side of things, if they type in Stephen Morris Rammed Earth and Facebook, my Facebook page would come up.
I'll put a link to that in the notes as well. Thank you both of you for the time and just for sharing from your hearts and your experience with the Lord through all these years. I'm always so encouraged to see people who have just persevered through the ups and downs of ministry and mission life. And so thank you for what that's worth. And thank you so much for taking time to
us.
If this is a new podcast for you, then I'd encourage you to go back and check out some of our previous guests. And please do take a moment to share this podcast with others you know who may be interested.
Find us online at missionchats.com